First, magic. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. Carl Jung. Prologue. Sigmund Freud once said that the goal of all life is death. I paused from getting into the now empty hearse, looking from the black-gloved hand gripping my arm, to the woman who'd spoken the depressing words. She wore a frumpy hat with white feathers and small red balls reminding me of cranberries. I tore my eyes away from the feathery concoction and stared at her. Like a typical adult speaking to a teenager, she most likely thought her words profound, a small, passed-on piece of wisdom to make me feel less miserable about suddenly becoming an orphan. "What are you saying?" I asked, wiping my wet, snow-colored hair away from my cheek. Rain at a funeral meant something, but I couldn't remember what. The woman tilted her head and gave me a sympathetic smile as if my simple brain couldn't reason. In actuality, I knew full well what Freud meant, but I simply thought it was a stupid comment. Why would life's goal be death? Unless life was on Prozac and lying in bed all day watching the soap network, I highly doubted life's goal included death. Anyone living life shouldn't be concerned with death at all. My mother had taught me that. Sure, her life ended tragically, just like my father's, but all those who knew her knew that dying was the last thing on her mind. Maybe that was the problem, and the problem with my father, too. The woman began speaking again, no doubt explaining the rationale behind the lame quote, but I wasn't listening. I wasn't even staring at her cranberry hat anymore. I looked beyond it, back where my father lay stuffed in a casket. Only my Uncle Jake remained, staring into my dad's grave. He would be like the rest of my family and wouldn't avoid death if it came for him. But I would. I made up my mind right then and there, while Fruit had rattled on about the necessity of death. Death would never claim me. I would blend in with society, and not try to stand out as others of my kind always did. Inevitably, that is always what got them killed. Even my mother, who insisted she was safe, died in spite of the fears, almost obsessive protection of my father. She could have lived a lot longer if she hadn't been so boisterous and colorful. Of course, that is why everyone loved her. She brought joy to their normally depressed lives. This, she told me, is the Aur's purpose, to use our gift to comfort the heavy-hearted and provide light to those who are lost. At the time she told me this, it sounded as wonderful as pink lemonade and cotton candy in summer, but now the thought of being someone's raggedy Kleenex was unbearable. I ignored the lecturing woman and jumped into the front seat of the hearse, shutting the door behind me. The driver asked, "Did you want to wait for your uncle, Lona?" "No, he'll come when he's ready. Please just take me home." As we pulled away from the cemetery, I didn't look back. My mind was on the future and on my survival. Chapter 1. Every living thing will fight for its place on Earth, Mr. Yazzie, my science teacher, said. He stood in front of the class, chalk dust smeared on the front of his blue polo shirt. The blackboard behind him contrasted with the yellow walls, but his polyester pants matched the mustard color perfectly. I leaned forward, chewing on my pen while he continued. But if their environment changes and they don't learn to adapt, then they will inevitably die. Nothing can save them. I lowered my gaze to the desk, wondering if I'd done enough to adapt. I hoped so because I was sick of moving. Since my father's funeral 5 years ago, my Uncle Jake and I had moved 4 times, finally settling in Wildemoor. I liked Wildemoor. It had a rural feeling to it and lots of tall, mountainous trees, but at the same time had all the amenities of a big city. I couldn't complain about the weather, either. Wildemoor wasn't as cold as Coast City. Gratefully, I only had to endure the cold of Coast City for a few months before I decided it was time to move again. A bell sounded, interrupting my biology teacher just as he was about to reveal who he thought would win in a cage fight, protozoa or flagella. His face fell when students jumped up and rushed the door. "Don't forget about the assembly," he called after them. I let the classroom empty before I stood to relieve my stiff joints. Because of my delay, I caught Mr. Yazzie contorting his body into what looked like a dance position, elbows bent, hands outstretched. He shuffled his feet a few times before he finally thrust his hips forward and left the room. I felt confident he wouldn't have done such an uncharacteristic move if he had realized I was still in the room, but alas, I often went unnoticed. Being invisible is, after all, my priority. I gathered my books and followed Mr. Yazzie out the door. He didn't attempt the awkward jig again, but I had to wonder what caused this sudden break of character. Perhaps he had a hot date tonight, a lady friend he had met on the internet. Walking in front of me, Mr. Yazzie reached behind his back and tugged at invisible material stuck deep inside his butt crack. Okay, so maybe not a hot date. Maybe it was the season premiere of some new sci-fi series involving flagella and protozoa battling one another to the death. This theory made much more sense. I veered to the left and down a long hallway to my locker, where I dropped off my books. I considered skipping the morning assembly. It was just a mini pep rally put on by the principal to get us excited for the new school year. Behind me, other seniors had the same idea, but they bravely acted upon their desire and disappeared out a nearby door. I decided not to follow in case someone saw me. I might be considered cool if caught and thereby labeled. I was comfortable with my current label of weird girl or who? And I didn't want that to change. I followed the sounds of noisy students down the hall and toward the gym. Highland High was like every other school I'd been to, light tan brick exterior, white interior walls, and shortweave blue speckled carpet. The schools even smelled the same, sweat and chemicals, masked occasionally by a squirt of fruity perfume. I moved into the gym and was about to cross to the other side when I heard, "Lona. Up here." May was sitting at the top of the bleachers holding a bag of chips. Today she sat with the stoners. Even though I knew she didn't get high, she blended in with them well. She wore a baggy, black sweatshirt and gray sweatpants. Her dark, shoulder-length black hair may have been combed earlier, but now looked a mess. Her whole appearance looked unnatural, masking her true beauty. I maneuvered my way up to her, careful to avoid stepping on anyone. About halfway, two freshman guys began wrestling. One of them bumped into me and knocked me off balance. Afraid to reach out, I fell forward toward a girl with red hair. She had a metal clip of a grasshopper or a dragonfly, I couldn't be sure, sticking out of her hair. I closed my eyes and waited to feel the bug sting when arms encircled my waist and pulled me back up. The grip was strong, the motion skilled. I sucked in a breath and turned to thank my hero, but when I looked into his eyes, I couldn't speak. They were the color of the sky after a spring thunderstorm and were filled with as much calm. "It's Lona, right?" the boy asked, smiling. I flinched when he said my name. How did he know it? As far as I knew, only one person knew my name, May. I immediately prickled, brought up walls with mental 10-inch spikes. "How do you know my name?" He frowned, legit lines creasing his forehead. "Doesn't everyone?" I searched his blue eyes, wondering what he meant. His tone wasn't insulting, and yet, how else would he and others know my name unless word spread of how strange I was? It couldn't have been anything else. I wasn't popular, that much I was certain. I gurgled something unintelligible, making his frown deepen. The expression looked wrong on him, unlike his smile. I wished I could have told him so, but I suddenly became aware of his hands still touching my waist. The heat from his touch burned into me, made my heart pound in ways it never had before. "Hey, Lona. You coming up here or what?" May barked from above. I looked past my hero. Behind him, May stood, hands on hips. "Gotta go." I slid past him and took the next step up the bleachers, barely finding room for my big foot between two students. Finally, I sat next to May, my head down. I didn't dare look up for fear of meeting the strange boy's eyes again. "What was that all about?" May asked. I almost fell. "That guy saved me." "Who is he? Is he looking?" "He's way good looking." I elbowed her. "Is he looking at me?" Nope." "Who is he?" "I don't know. Give me to the end of the day. I'll find out everything there is to know about him." May sucked a chip into her mouth. I risked a glance upward. As if he could feel my eyes on him, he turned and stared at me with those intense blue eyes. Knowledge lurked beyond those glossy orbs, the kind that frightened me. A cold chill walked its way up my spine and exploded on my arms in the form of goosebumps. May noticed. "You good?" I averted my gaze and rubbed at my arms. "Cold as all." From the center of the gym floor, the principal, Mr. Wilcox, bellowed into a microphone. "Welcome, students. Thank you for coming to this exciting assembly this morning. We have a great program today and a wonderful speaker who will share her valuable experiences with us." He pulled up his pants, his signature move. He had an oddly large belly resting on top of exceptionally small legs. This odd combination must have made wearing pants extremely difficult. Mr. Wilcox opened his mouth to speak again, but a sound to his left distracted him. On the far end of the bleachers, two boys argued, their voices growing louder with each passing second. A few teachers hurried over to break it up, but before they could, the taller of the two boys shoved the other into a group of nearby students. One of them shoved back, and soon everyone was pushing and fighting. May stood, taking me with her. "Sweet. A fight. We should totally join." Teachers swarmed the area to take control of the situation, but because of all the students, they couldn't get up the bleachers. All they could do was yell, which was as effective as a soccer coach for 3-year-olds. The mayhem slowly spread across the gym, and fights broke out everywhere. May moved to join a nearby one, a grin splitting her face, but I held her back. "Don't go. You know what might happen if you do." Her expression fell, and she slumped back into her seat, realizing I was right. And I hated that for her, but her secret had to be protected. From the corner of my eye, I saw a girl get punched in the face. She screamed as blood spurted from her nose. I covered my mouth with my hand, my heart thundering within my chest. More people were getting hurt. I glanced up at the wide, circular fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling. I could end this fight, but should I? A teacher fell to the ground and cried for help. More shouting, more crying. There was only one way to end this brawl quickly and safely. Staring at the lights, I concentrated hard. It was a lot to manipulate, but I felt confident I could do it. Turning lights on and off was the only part of my abilities I could reliably control. Lame, I know. My vision burrowed into the light above us until my consciousness connected to it. That's when I felt the burning inside me, rising from the shadows of the deepest parts of my mind. It coated my muscles and bones, raced through my blood in a fevered heat. The first magic, a power I barely understood. Sweat broke on my forehead, and my jaw clamped shut as I tried to control the light. Turn off. Turn off. Turn off. My insides rattled, making my bones aches. So much power. I gave one final mental push. Turn off. A burst of energy exploded from me like juice squeezed from a lemon. Then there was darkness. Chapter 2. When I was a child, my mother would tell me a bedtime story. At first I loved the dramatic tale, but after hearing it night after night, I grew bored. I often asked for a different one, a book even, like other children, but she always insisted on telling our own history. Sometimes she would introduce new characters or change the scenery, but the plot remained the same. Once upon a time, thousands of years ago, light lived among men as intelligent beings. Their presence brought equality and harmony to the humans, and the world was at peace. There was no sadness, pity, or pride. It seemed the righteousness of the people had banned evil from the earth. But when an older prince became jealous of his father's love for his younger brother, he murdered the young prince in cold blood. This deliberate evil brought the once forbidden darkness to the prince's heart, where he allowed it to remain. There he entertained it, fed it, until darkness overtook his thoughts and mind. Eager to corrupt others, he spread this darkness to those whose minds were open to greed, power, and lust. These new dark ones, vians as they were called, were unable to stand in light's presence without feeling unbearable pain. Hidden within the shadows of night, vians hunted and attacked the light-filled beings at their weakest moments, almost to the point of extinction. To preserve themselves and maintain balance between good and evil, light hid within the DNA of human females. These women passed light on to their female offspring, and they became known as auras. Auras protected their identity for many years, and even learned to use light's power to fight against the vians. But then the vians made a terrible discovery. They found that if they drank the blood of an aura, they were no longer bound to the night. Not only did the sun no longer pose a threat, but vians learned they could manipulate an aura's power, and they used it to grow stronger than ever before. For this reason, auras gathered from all over the earth to learn how to protect their human form. They created a council to oversee their safety, and to ensure auras appeared no different than others. I'd heard this story so many times that when my mother reached this point, I was usually asleep. I never knew why she had insisted on telling me the same story over and over until I had it memorized. Even my father had asked her once, "Can't you tell her a different story, Ella?" "No," my mother answered. "Lona needs to know light's history. The truth. She will know the truth because she has us. Let's hope so." Their hope had been in vain. Cries rose in the darkness, but they were no longer the angry voices of a mob. They were cries of surprise. The doors on both sides of the gym opened, spilling light from the hallways into the blackened gym and onto the basketball court. This time when a teacher yelled to exit, students listened. Was that insane or what? May asked. I couldn't answer. Mentally shutting the lights off had weakened my body. May touched me in the darkness. "You okay?" Yes, I mumbled. Students on our bench stood up to leave. Let's get out of here, May said. She followed the others out, but I remained still, allowing some time for my strength to return. A tall male form stepped up the bleachers. He looked like a muscular shadow, floating gracefully toward me. His movements seemed so fluid, I was surprised to hear the bleachers shake from the weight of his footsteps. "Are you all right?" a voice in a heavy English accent asked. It dripped with concern. My head began to swim, swirling in a sea of muted colors. It was going to take a lot longer to recover than. He touched me on the shoulder. "Do you want help down?" I shook my head, unable to speak, but I did manage to stand. Just barely. "Can you see okay in the dark?" he asked, beautifully and perfectly. "I think so." I followed him down the bleachers as if walking a tightrope. When we entered the crowded hallway, the man, probably a teacher, disappeared into a swarm of students. After a few deep breaths, I turned the opposite way and slowly headed toward my locker. Like always, I kept my head down and followed the steadily moving line of students. All of a sudden, for a reason I couldn't explain, I glanced up. Standing against a row of lockers was the same guy who had caught me earlier. He stared at me with a furrowed brow. Maybe he was just noticing how strange I looked. I knew my appearance was different, shockingly so. My ghostly pale skin appeared to melt into my blonde, almost white hair, making my eyes stand out like the blue of an Arctic wolf's. The only half-compliment I'd ever received, other than from my parents, was from one of Jake's friends. He said I was really pretty, in a freakish, Tim Burton sort of way. A compliment? Highly unlikely. Dropping my gaze, I continued forward, the only way past the guy. When I thought I'd walked far enough past him, I turned back around. He still ogled, but not the good kind. More like gaped at me with his mouth open, like I'd kicked his dog or something. Could he have known what I'd done back in the gym? I thought about it the whole way to my locker, then to my next class and well into Mrs. Simmons' lecture on Shakespeare. Impossible. No one could have known. He must be mad for some other reason. Maybe he was upset I'd fallen into him. I shrugged it off. Oh well. One more person who thinks I'm mentally deranged. Mrs. Simmons, who always wore pantsuits with shoulder pads, said, Shakespeare wrote, "So, you find where light in darkness lies, your light grows dark by losing of your eyes." Can anyone tell me what you think he was trying to say? For the third time in my school career, I raised my hand. I couldn't help it. This was one of my favorite quotes. Yes, Lona? The whole class turned and looked at me. It means you can't find light in darkness, and if you keep looking for it, you'll lose your soul. Erica, a popular girl, maybe even a cheerleader, I couldn't remember, laughed. Are you for real? A couple of students snickered. That's a good question, Erica, Mrs. Simmons said. My head snapped back to the teacher in shock. Did she just side with Erica? Is Lona's answer real? Mrs. Simmons asked. When no one answered, she added, I'll give you an example. Do you think it's possible for a person to continually attend parties where people use drugs? They have no intention of ever using themselves. They just want to go and have fun with friends. Is there anything wrong with that? The room fell silent. I could practically hear the grinding sounds of a faulty engine as their brains searched for an answer. Finally, the silence broke when another guy I didn't recognize raised his hand. I think her answer is real and happens all too often. Though a person's intentions seem good in the beginning, if they allow themselves to be a part of an environment that obviously ruins lives, they will first endure it, then pity the people involved, and eventually embrace the lifestyle themselves. Exactly. Thank you, Matt, Mrs. Simmons said. I see you know Alexander Pope's work. I agree entirely. Matt bowed his head as if a subject to a king in an English court. His long fingers swept sandy blonde hair behind his ears. He looked to be a little taller than me and skinny, but the good kind. Lean and muscular, the body of a runner. After the bell rang, I gathered my stuff and moved to stand. I practically ran into Matt, who was suddenly standing directly in front of me. My pulse raced as an intense feeling of being trapped washed over me. I like what you said about Shakespeare, he said. Not many people understand what he's all about. I swallowed a growing thickness in my throat. I'm not sure I do either. He's the master of cryptic. Matt laughed, a very non-threatening sound. Very true. Throwing my backpack over my shoulder, I tried to relax my tense muscles and step to the side of him, but he blocked me again. What the hell? Listen, he said, I'm trying to get a group together to study the writings of the great ones, sort of like a book club. You interested? I shuddered and searched his eyes for any deceit. I hated that I couldn't trust people, but I had to be careful. Things like this, being social, connecting with strangers, is what got our kind killed. Matt noticed my hesitation. It's okay if you can't. I was just asking. He turned around and walked away, his mouth tight. The light within me sparked, wanting to go after him. It was not in Light's nature to make others feel bad, and it coursed through me now, anxious to relieve any sadness I may have caused him. But I kept my feet firmly planted and closed my eyes. Survival first. It was my mother who would have gone after him. She loved being with others in any setting, and they loved her in return. Then she was murdered. Do you need something? Mrs. Simmons asked me. I blinked. No, sorry. I'm good. I bolted out of there and headed to my locker where I replaced my English book with my trig book, then zipped up my backpack. Most students didn't take their bags to every class, but there was something comforting about having it on my back. Without it, I felt naked. The bell rang just as I closed my locker. Freak me. I hurried down the almost empty hallway to my math class. We were getting a new teacher today. My old one officially went on maternity leave yesterday. I didn't know why she even bothered starting the new school year. After a couple of left turns, I found the classroom at the end of the hall. Before I turned the door's handle, I sucked a deep breath. I hoped whoever this new teacher was wouldn't be upset I was late. I pulled open the door, and like I expected, heads turned my direction. I hurried to the nearest vacant desk at the back of the room and dived into it. I casually glanced to the side. Matt sat next to me, grinning. I wrinkled my nose. What was he doing here? Granted, it was only the first week of school, but he hadn't been in here the few days previous. To try to be on time, please, the teacher said to me in a familiar English accent. I glanced up and met the gentle eyes of the same teacher who had escorted me from the gym. All thoughts of Matt left me. My new teacher was the most gorgeous, perfect man I'd ever seen. His thick, short hair was blacker than a moonless night, and his full, arched eyebrows hung above deep-set green eyes, shading them as if they were treasured emeralds. He was tall, almost towering, Or maybe it was his overpowering presence that made him seem so. He wore a black silk shirt tucked into gray trousers, and whenever he moved, disrupting the air around him, the thin material pressed against his stomach, revealing a tight six-pack of bulging muscles. As I was saying, he said. The string of words that followed were like one giant, single word. I should be paying attention, but my thoughts were too busy tripping over itself. As far as I was concerned, this man had only one flaw: he was my math teacher, and by the looks of him, at least 4 years older. I glanced at the chalkboard to read where he'd written his name. Mr. Steele. His name couldn't have been more perfect, like a shiny metal gun sculpted just right for my hand. I shivered. Sighing, I continued to watch his mouth open and close as he explained some complex math problem. Occasionally his eyes met mine, and when they did, my cheeks grew hot and my breathing quickened. I swallowed hard. This must be love at first sight. I always thought it would happen when I was older and with a guy more my age, but I guess love has no age restrictions. Too bad my infatuation is for an off-limits man. Didn't matter that I was turning 18 soon. I sighed again. Mr. Steele walked by me, and the faint smell of his cologne sent my head spinning. My knees weakened, but gratefully I was sitting down, so I did nothing but slump further into my seat. I removed a pen from my backpack and attempted to write, but when I looked down there was nothing on the paper. I shook the pen hard and began to write again, but still nothing came out. I stared at it for what seemed like an eternity, until I realized I hadn't been writing with a pen at all. In my hand, I gripped my mascara. I looked up hoping no one noticed, but I wasn't that lucky. Mike Miller was staring at me as if I'd just shaved my head. He rolled his eyes and looked back toward Mr. Steele, who had returned to the chalkboard to continue his math dance with a piece of chalk. I quickly shoved the mascara back in my bag and felt around for a real pen. My fingers grazed something soft, yet stiff. Wondering what it could be, I took hold of its small form and pulled it out. It fit in my palm like a lucky rabbit's foot, but there was nothing fortunate about it. My teeth clamped down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. It was the only way I could keep from screaming.